The night the screens died, Diana Castellano felt 15 years of work collapse into a single, relentless red glow. Her office had always been a monument to hard choices. Floor-to-ceiling glass, a desk so clean it looked ceremonial, a leather chair that had learned the shape of her spine. Outside, the Manhattan skyline was a smear of rain and neon. Inside, the monitors along the mahogany wall cascaded error after error until the whole room hummed like a troubled hive. On the conference call, voices overlapped: legal, investors, the merger council in whispered breaths. $12 billion hung like a coin spinning on a pin. Dawn was 4 hours away. Diana stood with her hand on the glass, watching the city make itself small. She had built Castellano Ventures from a Ford-class apartment and a stubborn refusal to stop into a firm that could bulldoze industries. The deal was supposed to be her vindication, and, secretly, the apology she never got to give to the life she had let go. A handful of missed birthdays, a childhood she'd outsourced to calendars. She had invested in metrics and machines, in teams that performed with the chilly precision of clockwork. Crisis felt, until that night, like a challenge she could solve with more work. Then the building lights flicked. The elevators hiccuped. In the server corridors below, a slow red pulse cut through the darkness like a heartbeat in a tomb. When the first security guard called to say the primary cluster had gone dark, Diana's stomach fell into an unfamiliar, animal place. It was one thing to lose minutes, another to watch 7 years of database snapshots, client contracts, encryption keys, live transaction ledgers, all the scaffolding of a merger, unwind in a matter of minutes. Panic is not dramatic, it is practical. The first practical question was containment. What could be made to stop bleeding before the investors saw the wound? Most of the floor had emptied in record time. Senior partners vanished into the mist of emergency calls. The phones in Diana's office echoed hollowly, their screens listing names she should have called long before she called them now. Maria in compliance, Jonah in PR, the council team. No one stayed. Not because they did not care, but because in crises their reflex was to retreat into their domains. Diana, who had steadied herself in worse storms, felt loosening around the edges. When Jamie Sullivan pushed open the glass door of her office, he carried a mop bucket and a kind of quiet the room had stopped expecting. He was a compact man in a custodian's uniform, sleeves rolled, hair damp from the night air. The mop looked absurd in that room. He moved differently than the executives who moved like they belonged to an instruction manual. Jamie's eyes met hers with a plainness that read like a promise: I'm here. There had never been a time when Diana would have noticed the janitor on the night shifts. He belonged to the perimeter, always visible in the corners, never the center of decisions. But tonight, the center of decisions had become a blunt instrument. Jamie walked in as if he belonged. He set the mop against the wall, wiped his hands on a towel, and said, "Systems are down. I can help." His voice was neither boastful nor pleading. It was quiet and certain. Diana looked at him. The room held 1,000 judgments. "You understand security systems?" she asked, blunt and pragmatic. The question was not about credentials, it was about risk. Jamie laughed softly, a sound that had no arrogance. "I used to build them," he said, "before I scrubbed floors." He did not offer the story like an apology, he offered it like a set of tools he still kept in his pockets. The staff in the conference room exchanged looks like sheets of paper being folded. Stephanie Kim, the CTO, was there before Jamie finished the sentence, arms crossed, jaw tight. Stephanie's glance skimmed over him like a judge inspecting a late entrant to a marathon. "We've got contractors in place," she said. Her tone was sharp. She had spent the last 5 years building a team that ran on precision and, right now, on control. Jamie did not flinch. He stepped down to the server bay with the security officer and Diana trailing, because Diana had the sense to follow anything that might buy time. She had learned that leaders must sometimes follow foolishness to find sense. The server room smelled like cold metal and dust. Racks stood like blackened skeletons with the occasional blue LED blinking as a heartbeat. Cooling fans rasped, some silent, some chaotically loud. The screens on the monitoring wall blinked in staccato. Error, fail, breach. Rows of servers held the company's memory, contracts, encryption keys, client histories, the hum of commerce. The building had a kind of reverential dimness, punctuated by the throbbing of machines. Jamie moved through it with the ease of someone who had once slept by racks and trusted the language of fans and lights. He put his hands on a console and hummed, as if listening. "It's not a random strike," he said finally. "They went after the replication nodes. If we can isolate the infected segments and pull from the last segmented backup, we buy time to restore transaction records. We need to separate the clusters, quarantine them, and spin a decoy to keep whoever's inside busy." He said it plainly, as if describing how to fix a leaky faucet. Diana took in every word like a lifeline. "You can do that?" she asked. "I can start it," he replied. "It won't be fast, it won't be clean, but we can make the system look whole long enough to close the deal." The board meeting upstairs wanted answers in 5 minutes. Real solutions take nights. That was the reality of the trade-off Diana had learned to make. Patience with numbers, time with consequences. She could have closed offices, called counsel, and ruined reputations with one phone call. Instead, she said, "Do it." An improbable hush fell across the room. Jamie's hands moved with the slow choreography of practiced work. He spoke to the machines as if they were people he had known. "I need the segmented backup keys. Reroute that node. Pull the archive from air-gapped storage." Each request was a small ignition, each permission a relay in a long relay race. People who knew better kept quiet and found ways to facilitate. The security officer unlocked but did not stand in the way. Stephanie watched, jaw clamped, suspicious as a mother seeing a stranger approach her child. For hours, Jamie worked. It was not cinematic sparking or miraculous typing and everything fixed. It was ritual. He drained the compromised network of access, thread by cautious thread. He unplugged the clearly affected segments, rerouted the traffic into neutral lanes, and started a recovery from backups that had been stored in segmented, intentionally imperfect ways precisely for nights such as this. He set up a decoy, a simple, blunt thing, no more than configured responses pretending to be the live ledger. A honeypot, like an empty vault, painted with a sign that said, "Here be treasure." The idea was to keep the intruder occupied while he rebuilt the real system elsewhere, piece by patient piece. In the middle of the night, a kettle on the floor clicked off as someone burned an instant coffee. A thin fluorescent light buzzed over their head. Diana sat on a folding chair with her jacket wrapped around her shoulders. She had taken off her shoes 2 hours earlier. The heels left a faint ache in her lower back that she felt now as something like a moral bruise. She watched Jamie's profile, his working brow, the faint crease near his temple, the small, careful movements of someone who knew when to breathe and when not to. "You used to," she prompted softly, more human than boss. "My life before Ruby," Jamie said. The answer carried a map. He had been a cybersecurity analyst for a mid-sized firm that handled sensitive infrastructure. There were photographs of his life somewhere. Old IDs, bad cafeteria coffee, late-night debugging. His wife, Natalie, had died 2 years ago after an illness that made the world strangely vast and lonely. Jamie left his job not because he had failed at it, but because the demands were incompatible with the only thing he now guarded, his daughter. He had taken the janitor's night shift so he could be home when Ruby came back from school, to make dinner, to stitch the fabric of ordinary life. The job was honest and small and gave him presence. It gave him the 2 most important things he had left, time and proximity. Ruby, 7 and unabashed in the way children are, was the warmth that hardened his jaw into purpose. Diana had glimpsed her drawing on the fridge of the office she'd visited briefly. Stick figures and a house with a sun that had too many rays. Ruby's name had quickly become a talisman in Jamie's sentences. "She needs to be the first person I get home to," he said once at dawn, like an oath. Diana had made sacrifices of a different stripe. Her life had been investments, cutthroat decisions, reputations balanced on the tightrope of perception. The deal at dawn was supposed to be her legacy, the culmination of strategy, the sort of headline that made her name synonymous with power. But standing there in the cold fluorescence, she watched a man whose currency was different from hers rebuild the thing she had spent a decade building. There was a peculiar hollow in her that this scene filled, gratitude arriving late and smelling faintly of coffee and disinfectant. Throughout the night, the team in the room moved like a low-visibility crew on a salvage ship. Stephanie hovered near the periphery, her phone lit and voice clipped. She offered corrections, suggestions that landed like small pebbles into a calm pond. Her skepticism was not only professional. She had been passed over for this moment of authority once the first responders recommended staying the course. Pride and process do not mix easily with being undercut by a man in a custodian uniform. At 2 in the morning, a monitoring screen sparked. The decoy looked convincing. Someone poked at the shiny, obvious bait. Logs showed an automated script interacting with the honeypot like a nervous animal. Jamie called it out, the words a scientist's excitement. "We've got activity on the decoy," he said. "They're taking the bait." For a moment, the room exhaled. The immediate emergency did not evaporate, it changed shape. Instead of a general systemic collapse, they now had evidence. Someone inside had access and was willing to fall for a trap. Working on restoration is like stitching a frayed blanket. Every patch must meet the worn fabric and match the thread. Jamie patched together clean segments from air-gapped backups, verified checksums against the archived records, and then slowly brought services back online in segmented windows so they could watch for anomalies. It was tedious, painful, and, when it succeeded, acutely joyful. A database became responsive again, a key decrypted. The trading ledger resynced in staggered batches. The company's central dashboard flickered from dead to yellow to green like a patient woken. When the last major node answered, Diana felt a physical loosening, a muscle she'd held tight for years unclenching. The call with the merging partners went from a stutter to an urgent, brightened rhythm. "We can proceed," she told them, each word brittle and then firm. Investors on the line were quiet, but their silence was not suspicion. It was astonishment. In the chilly dawn, a fragile normalcy returned. They called Jamie a hero in the press release that morning, a line that tasted of papier-mâché and gratitude wrapped in corporate polish. In the immediate aftermath, the company board recommended Jamie for a permanent role, lead for incident response, a modest title that would afford him flexibility and resources. The recommendation was pragmatic. Having the person who had saved your servers in-house is a good PR and a smarter operational move. Stephanie did not applaud. She stood with her arms crossed as others clapped, watching Jamie as if the applause were a foreign object he had somehow appropriated. "We should have run concurrent audits before we put the system back live," she said finally, a thin critique meant to anchor suspicion. "We need a full forensic sweep." Jamie nodded, agreeing. He did not relish congratulations. He relished being useful. "We'll do forensics," he said. "We need logs, time-synced snapshots, and to trace where the traffic originated. There's metadata in packet timing, accounts used, little fingerprints that don't lie. If someone inside has access, we'll find the trail." He said that last part without drama. It was a promise to the machines and to the people. The cameras on the server racks had recorded activity. Keycard swipes logged at odd hours, maintenance accesses that should not have had full privileges. Forensics, Jamie warned, would be patience work. They would follow threads, transactions to accounts, to shell corporations, to the financial trails that less careful people left like breadcrumbs. It would not be instant. It would be painstaking. That was the truth Diana liked and often refused. Plausible, measured, real. After the system stabilized, Diana insisted on a small moment of private thanks. She found Jamie in the break room at 5 a.m., hands wrapped around a styrofoam cup, eyeliner smudged by fluorescent light. He looked tired, in a way only someone who had carried another's life could look, eyes raw, voice steady. Diana said, simply, "You saved us." Jamie tilted his head, searching for anything like grandiosity, and finding none. "We bought time," he corrected gently. "Time to patch, time to investigate." His answer was not modesty, it was accuracy. "Whatever you call it, you changed things," Diana said. Her voice had shifted, there was a softness that felt like admission. "You changed my life." He looked at her like someone cataloging a small miracle. "You gave me the chance to do the job I used to do," he said, "and you kept a bunch of people's jobs. That matters." The phrase sat between them, "changed my life." Diana had long ago learned to value statements where people claimed to be changed. They were rarer than promotions. In that quiet, she recognized the line between the cost of her ambition and the weight of what she'd been trying to preserve. People's livelihoods, families, futures. The night had tilted her perspective. The accolade was not the point. The human accountability behind it was. At the board meeting the next morning, the tone was different. Investors who had been waiting to pounce listened as Diana stood and, with a controlled voice, explained the incident and the firm's transparent response. She framed it not as a failure, but as a crucible. Emergency containment, immediate recovery, the promise of a full forensic examination, and a pledge of open communication. That last part, transparent leadership, was new from her. She had learned there are times when trust is mended in public, not behind closed doors. Yet beneath the applause and the press releases, a small, stubborn tension began to weave itself into the story. The logs Jamie had pulled did not only show external probes, they showed privileged keys used at odd hours from accounts tied to the corporate finance wing. The pattern was not random. Someone who had internal knowledge had routed the data through a set of shell companies, a labyrinth intended to hide where the money would eventually land. The breadcrumbs were faint but present, like footprints in wet cement that the wind could not scrub away. Stephanie, who had guarded protocols like commandments, watched those logs with a calculation that made Diana uneasy. It was not that she expected betrayal from her CTO. It was that the human tendency to suspect those closest to mistakes can be a refuge for people who fear being found out themselves. "We should look at access lists," Stephanie said. "Look for privilege escalation. Wherever the accounts were used, follow the chain." Jamie agreed. He was careful not to point fingers. The investigation would need time and the cooperation of multiple departments. He asked for a clean, closed environment for analysis, air-gapped copies of logs, legal oversight. Diana authorized everything. She had promised transparency, and she knew the first step was to let evidence speak. That afternoon, before the world had fully digested the story of the janitor who saved a $12 billion merger, Jamie slipped into the parking garage to get his car. The concrete smelled faintly of gasoline and rain. The security camera ticked across and recorded everything. His worn boots, the reflective stripe on his pants, the way he bent to peer under the bumper. He had been looking for a loose sensor, something to fix. Instead, he found a small black device pressed into the undercarriage, clean, almost new, affixed in a place only someone who put thought into stalking would know to look. His hands did not tremble when he touched it, but the air did. The device was compact, anonymous enough to be mistaken for a common service connector. He had seen tracking devices before, and he had seen what they meant. That small object translated to a message he had not been prepared for. Someone was watching him. Jamie did what he had to do. He recorded the serial number, photographed the device, and removed it carefully. He did not throw it away. He kept it in his jacket pocket like a coin you study under a lamp. The caretaker in him cataloged logistics and risk in equal measure. Where to take it, who to tell, how to protect Ruby tomorrow when she boarded the bus. He texted Laura, the babysitter, to ask her to keep Ruby from the schoolyard pickup route for a day, citing a cold he did not have. He wanted the small lie to give them both a margin of safety. When he told Diana about the device, Briefly, in hushed words across the conference table, her face did not show the showy kind of worry that would make headlines. It showed the kind that had been forming all week, a commitment to act with careful force. "We'll involve federal," she said. "This is beyond us." Her voice was the quiet one that returned to center when the world tried to tilt. Jamie nodded. He kept a picture of Ruby in his wallet, the one with marker sun rays and lopsided houses. He placed it on his bedside table that night and let his hand rest over it until sleep arrived, thin as gauze. That was where the first chapter closed. Systems restored, headlines written, a promotion proposed. Yet as metrics corrected and markets steadied, a new, colder fact had been introduced. Someone had the capacity to follow him home. The device under the bumper was a signal that the event that one night had intermittently bound Diana and Jamie was not merely an isolated act of sabotage. It was part of a set of choices someone inside the company had made, and the choices had consequences that could touch the small, fragile life Jamie kept safe. The incredible moment when a janitor stepped into a server room and bought the world time had shifted more than a ledger. It had shifted the gravitational center of trust inside Castellano Ventures. People who had been invisible were now visible by necessity. A man who swept floors had become central to the firm's survival. Diana, for the first time in a long time, began to see the scaffolding of her empire differently. The systems that mattered were not only code and contracts, but people, carrying histories and responsibilities. She had been changed that night, and the reverberations of that change were only beginning. As dawn edged over the glass and the city exhaled, the company breathed too. But the breath was thin and cautious. Jamie tucked the tracking device into an evidence envelope later that morning before the federal agents came through the doors. He stood watching them mark and photograph, catalog and secure. He watched Valerie Stone, the CFO, in the background, her expression an artless mask of composure. He wondered about all the things people keep behind masks: resentment, calculus, survival strategies. When Diana climbed back to her office and looked at the skyline, she did not see a prize so much as a map of the people below. The incredible moment had arrived in a mop bucket and quiet competence. It had saved the deal and shifted her interior landscape. The systems that mattered were not only code and contracts, but people carrying histories and responsibilities. She had been changed that night, and the reverberations of that change were only beginning. As dawn edged over the glass and the city exhaled, the company breathed too. But the breath was thin and cautious. Jamie tucked the tracking device into an evidence envelope later that morning before the federal agents came through the doors. He stood watching them mark and photograph, catalog and secure. He watched Valerie Stone, the CFO, in the background, her expression an artless mask of composure. He wondered about all the things people keep behind masks: resentment, calculus, survival strategies. When Diana climbed back to her office and looked at the skyline, she did not see a prize so much as a map of the people below. The incredible moment had arrived in a mop bucket and quiet competence. It had saved the deal and shifted her interior landscape. But the next day's questions were big and knotted. Who within her walls had access and motive to betray the company? And who among them was willing to risk being found out once someone like Jamie started tracing the threads? The night had been a hinge. On one side lay corporate salvation. On the other, the slow, careful work of unmasking a betrayal that could not be solved with heroic hours alone. There would be logs to parse, transactions to trace to shell companies, return addresses in financial ledgers that hid behind layers of plausible deniability. There would be arguments and finger-pointing, lawyers and media cycles. And there would be Jamie, whose life outside the servers pulsed with the urgent normality of bedtime stories and scraped knees, stepping forward to do a job he had once loved and stepped away from for the love of his child. In the hours that followed the rescue, Diana walked the floors. Her steps were deliberate, Her decisions were newly softened by what she had witnessed. A man whose hands were rough from work, who had once been an architect of systems, now cleaning the small things that make life bearable. She thought about the Second Chance program she had been drafting in board meetings, an initiative meant to reframe recruitment around overlooked potential. The slogan sat somewhere in her head like an unfinished draft. Tonight, it became less a policy and more a moral imperative. But policy had to be married to procedure. Forensics needed time. The board demanded immediate assurance that this would not happen again. Investors whispered about contingencies and fines. The press wanted a story that fit into neat sentences. If there was one lesson that night taught her, it was that the neat sentences seldom matched the messy truth. The deal would proceed because markets favored continuity and competent damage control. Yet in the quiet corners, the messy truth was that trust had to be rebuilt, not just declared. As the city brightened into day, Jamie drove home on a route a little longer than necessary, hand on the steering wheel, thinking through sequences of mundane things: Ruby's toast, the dentist appointment, a school project about the solar system. He thought about vulnerability in systems and vulnerability in people. He remembered Natalie's laugh, the way it had filled rooms. He thought about the way hands can mend machines and hearts in equal measure. When he walked into their small apartment, Ruby ran to him with a crayon-smeared paper pressed into her small fist. "You're a hero, Daddy," she said, without irony, because children have the purity to call a thing by its name before cynicism teaches them otherwise. Jamie kissed the top of her head and tucked the tracking device in a drawer behind a stack of unpaid bills. He did not tell her about the device or about the threats. He made her toast and listened to her recite facts about Mars. When he walked into their small apartment, Ruby ran to him with a crayon-smeared paper pressed into her small fist. "You're a hero, Daddy," she said, without irony, because children have the purity to call a thing by its name before cynicism teaches them otherwise. Jamie kissed the top of her head and tucked the tracking device in a drawer behind a stack of unpaid bills. He did not tell her about the device or about the threats. He made her toast and listened to her recite facts about Mars. When he walked into their small apartment, Ruby ran to him with a crayon-smeared paper pressed into her small fist. "You're a hero, Daddy," she said, without irony, because children have the purity to call a thing by its name before cynicism teaches them otherwise. Jamie kissed the top of her head and tucked the tracking device in a drawer behind a stack of unpaid bills. He did not tell her about the device or about the threats. He made her toast and listened to her recite facts about Mars. When he walked into their small apartment, Ruby ran to him with a crayon-smeared paper pressed into her small fist. "You're a hero, Daddy," she said, without irony, because children have the purity to call a thing by its name before cynicism teaches them otherwise. Jamie kissed the top of her head and tucked the tracking device in a drawer behind a stack of unpaid bills. He did not tell her about the device or about the threats. He made her toast and listened to her recite facts about Mars. That was how he protected the life he had remade, not by building walls around it, but by keeping the ordinary from dissolution. 2 weeks later, as the initial press cycle cooled and the market steadied, the company announced a modest internal reorganization. Jamie was formally offered the lead incident response role with a flexible schedule, a title, and resources to build a team. Diana announced a pilot initiative, targeted hires from non-traditional backgrounds, flexible work policies for parents, and a promise to review governance structures. The words were careful, but the intent seemed real. For Diana, this was the moment to translate feeling into policy. Around the same time, the forensic team produced the first meaningful leads, anomalous transfers that, when traced, dripped down into accounts with names not on any corporate roster, but linked through a thin web of corporate entities to an outside firm that had been pursuing acquisition interests for months. The pattern suggested someone inside had siphoned data in exchange for money, not ideology. Money followed motive in a practical, unromantic way. Whispers began to point at people who had the access and the motive.
Stephanie lingered in those whispers because of disputes over control of certain systems. She had the technical means and the temperament for secrecy. It was easier for a community to part with suspicion than with institutional doubt. Yet, suspicion is never proof. The incredible night remained a hinge, an obvious pivot of event and emotion. It had saved a deal and opened a wound. Diana, who had become used to negotiating markets, now had to negotiate human frailty. Jamie, who had traded the sharp edges of a career for the steady warmth of parenting, found himself back in a world of scaled risk. Both had been changed by one night's work. Now they would have to navigate the consequences with patience, with policy, and with the slow, exacting work of forensic truth. The company's immediate stability had been bought. The larger fight, against whoever had chosen to betray them from within, was just beginning. The cameras in the stairwells recorded comings and goings, emails waited in servers for deeper breaths. The small black object under Jamie's car had turned a repair into a hunt. As the first light of day sloped across the office floor, Diana watched the city and thought not of the deal, but of the people who kept the deal alive. She thought of the janitor who had walked into her life and shifted it forever. If you're moved by stories where unseen people are finally seen, consider subscribing. There are more like this. That night had been the beginning. The recovery of systems was finished. The unmasking of betrayal had not yet begun.
He taught them patience, how to read logs not as lines of inscrutable code, but as a conversation in which timing and frequency spoke like accents. He taught them how a honeypot could be a decoy vault, set to glimmer in the wrong places so that a thief turned by greed would show the way to their own door. He refused to dramatize. He insisted on process. They followed the money first. Transaction chains are not clever, only timid. They pour into holding accounts and then out to other shell corporations that exist only on paper. Little islands with no employees and no offices. The forensic accountant on Jamie's team called them name farms. He compared the path of data to a river that, when disturbed, leaves mud on its banks. Metadata, the digital fingerprints of when, how, and from where data moved, told stories that the criminals thought they had buried. It was a patient sort of detective work, more like listening than striking. At first, suspicion perched on Stephanie because she had motive in the eyes of some, an old argument with Valerie over budget cuts, professional bruises from having her authority undercut. But Stephanie, who had been prickly and protective, had also been careful in the way of engineers. Her access rights were bound to a history of approvals, and her logs told the story of someone awake at her console, fighting to hold systems together that night. The team checked access trees and cross-referenced keycard timestamps. Stephanie's alibi, an impromptu 3-hour emergency patch she had pushed in the late evening, checked out in the logs, corroborated by the team and by her own terse timestamps. Suspicion shifted, not because someone declared it, but because evidence has a way of relocating reasons. Piece by piece, a different portrait emerged. The trail bent towards the finance wing, accounts that had moved money in odd microtransactions, financial instruments that had been set up and then dismantled in ways meant to confuse. The forensic accountant found a route, micropayments laced into consultant invoices, then funneled through 2 layers of nominee companies before landing in an account linked to a shell entity associated with a firm pursuing acquisition interest in sectors Castellano Ventures had been evaluating. The name at the other end, Neuroline, was one of those shadow-strewn companies that appear in acquisition whispers. The deeper question was not whether Neuroline existed, it was whether someone inside Castellano Ventures had been passing data to them for profit. Valerie Stone's name surfaced along those transactional routes, not accidentally. Her signature, in digital and analog places, touched the approvals for third-party contracts in a period when the firm had been cutting costs and consolidating external relationships. The pattern did not paint her as a caricatured thief because Valerie had never been that sort of person. She had been careful, Calculating, a woman who had once courted risk like a chess player moving pieces forward with intention. Gone was the cartoon villain. In her place emerged motive, a mix of resentment, fear, and what she told herself were practicalities. They brought the evidence to Diana with an insistence that felt almost merciful. Here is what we have, here is what we know, here is what we will need to prove. The boardroom smelled of coffee and old power. Diana listened with a face that had relearned how to accept information without elbowing it for dominance. She could have demanded secrecy, hush money, a private settlement. Instead, she chose, with a steadiness that surprised even her, to do what she had promised the investors and the public: transparency. "We will involve federal prosecutors," Jamie said in the meeting, his voice leveled by the gravity of the work. "We'll hand off the chain of custody. We'll make sure every step is documented. If Valerie is involved, she will be prosecuted according to the evidence, not rumor." Valerie, when questioned by agents, maintained a composed inscrutability that had been her armor for years. In interviews, she spoke in cool, measured sentences. "I have always acted in the best interest of this company," she told an investigator. "My decisions were fiscal prudence." She framed herself as a steward in hard times. That narrative held certain persuasive qualities, until the financial forensics mapped transactions that bore her approval codes and showed periodic cleanings of consultant invoices tied to shell entities. When they served her with a search warrant, she did not scream or faint. She had an air of someone surprised at being seen in full daylight. Inside her office, agents photographed binders and desk calendars, copies of approvals, and an executive travel itinerary with notations that mattered, because small scribbles breed meaning. Valerie's rationalizations, once private, began to leak into the public domain through the indictment. Payments coded as consulting, invoices issued to companies with no verifiable employees, routing instructions that funneled data access in exchange for pecuniary compensation. Her defense team argued plausible deniability, standard practice in cases entangled in corporate complexity, but the forensic trail, patient and precise, threaded toward a formal indictment. Valerie's motives, as reconstructed by investigators, were a collage of cautions and ugliness. She had been under pressure to keep the firm solvent during a stretch of overextended acquisitions. Her compensation was tied to short-term liquidity metrics. Her worldview had hardened into a belief that the ends justified the means. Selling data, in her calculus, was a way to create liquidity quickly for the deals she believed would future-proof the company. She told herself that she had intended to use the proceeds not for personal luxury, but to close a critical acquisition that would secure jobs, an argument that mixed hubris with a perverse kind of stewardship. It was a story that did not absolve her, but made her human. A betrayed loyalty to outcomes, an ethical compromise justified by fear. The arrest, when it came, was quiet in the executive suite and brutal in the public square. Cameras caught Valerie in the glass vestibule as agents let her out, hair immaculate, expression measured, like a woman too practiced at endurance to show the rupture. She turned toward the press with that sort of corporate equanimity that reads as denial to some and dignity to others. Her lawyers promised to fight. She, for her part, delivered a final line to a reporter that would haunt the aftermath. "The rot runs deeper than one desk." It was both warning and confession. That phrase, "the rot runs deeper than one desk," echoed across the building in the weeks that followed. Investors demanded assurance and reorganization. The board, pricked by the fact that a CFO had allegedly betrayed the company for profit, convened emergency sessions on governance. Legal counsel revised approval chains. Procurement processes were placed under a stricter audit regime. Diana found herself in the strange role of moral narrator for the firm, responsible not only for business continuity, but for a story of remediation and reform. Jamie's life, in the middle of it all, was a study in juggling. He taught the new team how to build defenses that thought like children, playful enough to fool a predator into showing its preferences, subtle enough to record motives. He led the honeypot design, always careful to describe it as a decoy vault filled with convincing artifacts meant to distract and observe, never as a trap to be sprung on the unsuspecting. He coordinated with federal agents, who were patient and meticulous. They had learned not to allow theater to contaminate evidence. They needed a clean trail that could be presented in court. Threats escalated in ways that were unnerving but not melodramatic. Jamie found a photo on his windshield one morning, Ruby's kindergarten backpack, clearly photographed, with a note scrawled on the back that said in neat type, "Stop digging." He turned it over like a coin and passed it to the agents. Federal security advised him on practical, non-intrusive measures, varied routes, a temporary block on public postings, and a secure daycare pickup system that included trusted staff and alternate routes. Laura, the babysitter, tightened into a protective presence, her casual warmth turned into an iron routine of school calls and verification checks. One afternoon, as Jamie waited at the crossing to pick Ruby up, a car slowed and a man leaned out, asking directions for a street that didn't exist. Laura, watching, tensed. She recognized the pattern: cars that knew too much, men who kept too steady an eye. She walked Ruby back a half block under the pretense of needing more steps before carrying a folder out, and by the time the slow car returned the route, its measurement of them was thrown off. The incident did not become a headline. It became, in Jamie's mind, a confirmation that the danger was not rhetorical. There were nights when Jamie considered stepping back. The messages had been clinical, no explicit threats to bodily harm, but they were intimate in the way they indicated observation. He thought briefly of a life where the great moral choice was whether to sleep in his own living room or in a motel 2 towns over, where Ruby's bedtimes would be a distance. But decisions are not made in abstractions. Ruby wanted pancakes and stories about astronauts, and his reasoning always revolved back to that. He chose to continue, not because of adrenaline or bravado, but because the people he loved were anchored in small routines that needed protection. Jamie and Diana developed a rhythm of mutual protection. She petitioned the board to expand security measures not only for the servers, but for employees who were now visibly entangled in the fallout. She insisted the company fund a secure family liaison program for employees who might be targeted, transportation vouchers, temporary childcare stipends, and access to mental health support. She argued for discretion and dignity, not spectacle. In private, she visited Jamie's office with coffee and small practical tools, an encrypted phone for his work, and a voucher for a daycare she personally helped fund while the legal case proceeded. The gestures were small but meaningful, the kind of reparation that policy sometimes misses. The legal process unfolded on a scale that matched the complexity of the crimes. Valerie's arraignment was swift. The indictment charged conspiracy, wire fraud, and money laundering. Her defense argued plausible deniability, claiming miscommunications, lack of oversight, and errors in accounting. The prosecution presented transactional trails and signed approvals that linked her to the payments. Between the arraignment and the trial, there were pleas and motions, weeks of discovery, and testimony from procurement officers who had been asked for explanations of phantom invoices. The press loved drama, and the courtroom got its share. But for most people in the firm, the months were long and studious. Meetings about remote access, training sessions on privilege management, and policy overhauls that replaced trust by title with trust by evidence. During that stretch, Diana gave an interview to a business magazine. Nothing theatrical, mostly an insistence on transparency and a gentle admission of institutional failure. She did not hide the fact that someone in the C-suite had betrayed the company. She framed the response as a moral undertaking, to build policies not aimed at scapegoating, but at inclusion and accountability. The words were a departure.
The readers who followed her had been used to commodity statements about quarterly growth. Now they read about empathy and the humility of listening. She drafted, with the board's approval, the Second Chance Initiative, an actual program to recruit from backgrounds often overlooked, people returning from incarceration, military spouses, single parents with experience in underrated technical crafts, and yes, custodial staff with proven skill sets who had been previously invisible. The initiative required intention and resources. It began as a pilot. 3 hires in the Security Operations Center, stipends for retraining, and supportive policies for flexible schedules. Jamie's own team now included a former electrician who had learned basic scripting while rewiring shop floor machines, a mother who had taught herself network basics because her community center relied on her, and a young veteran with a talent for pattern recognition. They were, in many ways, the human fulfillment of the honeypot concept. Overlooked virtues that, when given a stage, performed in unexpected grace. Some of the board bristled. Change is expensive and intangible. Investors wanted ROI metrics. Diana drafted a plan that tied social policy to measurable outcomes, reduced incident response times, improved retention rates, and a reframing of risk. She argued that when a company builds a culture where small, ordinary people could call out anomalies without fear of being ignored, the company's resilience increases. It was part morality speech and part business case. The board, worn by scandal and moved by a narrative that reached the public in sympathetic tones, gave tentative approval. Valerie's trial moved like weather, variable and often cruel. Testimony from procurement staff, contractors, and forensic accountants laid out the practical mechanics of the alleged scheme. The prosecution presented a sequence of documents, approvals signed, email exchanges, odd invoice numbers. Valerie's defense painted a picture of a woman stretched thin, making hard choices in a volatile market. In the end, juries are human. They consider not only the documentation, but the person before them. The verdict would have to reckon with both. When the court returned a guilty verdict on several counts, fraud and conspiracy among them, Valerie's composure briefly cracked. In the corridor outside the courthouse, someone shouted, "You sold us out!" But Jamie, who stood with Diana just inside, did not feel triumph. He felt relief and loss combined. A conviction does not restore the trust that was broken, but it allows a company to start rebuilding without an internal leak actively draining the system. In the months after the verdict, Castellano Ventures settled several civil claims and launched an internal realignment. Diana led the announcement personally.
She stood on a modest stage in the company auditorium, light from the floor-to-ceiling windows painting her in the same dusky glow she had once thought of as vindication. This time, she spoke with a different calibration. "We made mistakes," she said. "We saw the wrong things and missed people who kept the company alive. That changes here. We owe our people more than platitudes. We owe them dignity and structures that match our words." The Second Chance program rolled out with an awkward and beautiful momentum. Interviews were conducted with a lens toward potential rather than pedigree. Jamie helped design the technical retraining course, contributing both his expertise and his lived experience. He insisted on mentorship pairings so that newcomers were not tossed into a sea of expectations. He fought for policies like 2 days a week of flexible home-based work for single parents, stipends for emergency childcare, and a modest fund for employees facing sudden crises. The policies were not perfect, but they were real work toward the stated goal. For Jamie, this was not charity, it was a structural reorientation. Months later, the company announced the Sullivan Innovation Center, named informally at first by an employee petition as a nod to the man who had gone from mop bucket to security lead. Diana approved the name with a quiet smile and a more formal intention. The center would be a hybrid lab and community space, focused on inclusive tech development and family-friendly policy testing. It would be a place where single parents could shadow teams, where custodial staff could apprentice in systems, and where mentors from the Second Chance program would teach. The center's mission statement, "See the unseen, build for everyone," hung on a plaque in the lobby, a simple literalization of the change Diana had come to value. On the day of the center's unveiling, media were invited, but the event was intentionally low-key, focused more on employees and families than on press optics. Ruby clung to Jamie's hand in the crowd, giggling and shy, her crayon drawings now framed and hung on a corkboard in one corner, suns with too many rays, houses with open doors. Diana moved through the guests like someone learning how to be present in small things. She knelt to speak to Ruby, who offered her a hand-drawn badge that read Hero Daddy, complete with a lopsided star. "That's very official," Diana said, accepting it with a theatrical solemnity that made Ruby beam. When Diana stepped to the podium to deliver a short speech, she had written it late into the night, she did not reach for the language of markets. Instead, she told the story of the night the screens died in a few sentences, not to dramatize, but to contextualize the lesson.
"There was a moment," she began, the title of the company's press release shimmering behind her on the screen in clean font, "when a janitor stepped into a server room and, by choosing to act, changed my life and changed this company." She paused to look at Jamie, whose jaw was set in awkward gratitude. She spoke then of seeing people, not an abstract ethics lecture, but a confession of failed attention, of how in chasing metrics she had often failed to look at the people who kept her empire functioning. She announced an end to a culture that prized titles over truths. She promised policy changes that would institutionalize empathy. She announced the Second Chance program's initial cohort and pledged resources to the Sullivan Innovation Center. When she finished, the standing ovation was not long or loud. It was the kind that feels like a collective exhale. The press wrote the narrative as they always did. A redemption arc, a billionaire who learned to see, the janitor who saved a deal. But inside the company, the change was slower, an accretion of new hires, a training course that actually led to promotions, policy memos that were translated into real budget lines. In small meetings, managers learned to ask employees about their commuting times and childcare responsibilities before scheduling all-hands meetings at 8 in the morning. In HR, the new family liaison took calls not as a PR task but as a practical service. Jamie's days acquired a new cadence. He still left for work early enough to be home for Ruby's return from school most afternoons. He still brewed bad coffee and ate lunches at his desk when the work demanded it. But his evenings contained a different kind of peace. He and Ruby established a ritual: Saturday pancakes and a walk to the park where they fed pigeons and named them, Blue, Fat, and one with a missing foot. He read Ruby strange, slightly archaic books about satellites and ancient inventions, wanting each story to be a small seed of curiosity that would grow without pressure. Diana sometimes dropped by after work, a cup of herbal tea and a small bag of groceries she had bought because Jamie once mentioned that his old toaster was on its last coil. The gestures became a ritual of mutual care, Diana practicing visibility in deeds, Jamie accepting help without losing his dignity. Their friendship remained unromantic, textured and solid. They began meeting monthly to review the security dashboard and to talk about policy barriers that were still stubborn. Diana told him about a childhood memory of her mother tucking a note into an old cookbook, just small things. And Jamie told her a story about how his wife Natalie used to leave a single green marker uncapped on the table for Ruby to find. They compared notes about rituals and losses and the small things that make life inhabitable. The company grew new muscles of transparency. When a junior analyst found an anomalous connection in a test environment months later, they did not hush it. They filed it, logged it, and opened an investigation that resolved quickly and quietly. Trust began to look less like a fragile glass sculpture and more like a net that caught small errors before they became catastrophes. The courtroom, months after the verdict, continued to be a place where consequences were rendered. Valerie, convicted and sentenced, served as a grim reminder not simply of individual weakness, but of how institutional neglect can become fertile ground for wrongdoing. Her lawyer appealed, motions were filed, legal avenues pursued. The book of litigation was thick and procedural. But the company had moved into a different chapter. A year passed.
The stock performance had weathered the scandal with a steadier performance than analysts predicted, in part because investors appreciated the frankness of recovery and the structural reforms that reduced operational risk. The Second Chance program produced two early success stories: a former mechanic who became a valued systems operator, and a stay-at-home parent who pivoted into quality assurance and later received a promotion. These were not about moral victory so much as about resourceful people being given tools to match their aptitude. The human stories recirculated inside the company with a warmth that numbers could not capture. On the anniversary of the night the screens died, Castellano Ventures held a small internal ceremony at the Sullivan Innovation Center. It was an event meant for employees and families. Ruby, now a little taller, ran a station where children could draw suns with too many rays, an echo that produced private smiles. Diana invited Jamie onto the modest stage where she had previously spoken. The room hummed with a gentler attention. Diana did not give a long speech. She was deliberate with her words, each sentence calibrated not for headlines but for people who had lived through the last year. She spoke of the incredible moment, not as a mythic rescue, but as the hinge where choices had become visible. That night, she said, was not just about systems. It was about a choice to see a person who had always been present and to allow that person, at last, to be part of the story of our company. Jamie, looking out at the faces, engineers, custodians, parents, children, felt something like an ache that was also a gratitude. For all the small ironies of being a man who swept floors and also taught cybersecurity, he recognized that the work ahead was not about accolades. It was about steady change, policy, culture, and a commitment to seeing. After the ceremony, they walked out into the soft glow of the early evening. Diana handed Jamie a small envelope, embarrassed by the simplicity of the gesture until he opened it to find a voucher. No strings, no publicity, paying for a small family vacation. "Take Ruby somewhere she hasn't seen before," Diana said.
You both deserve it. It was a thing that cost the company almost nothing, yet meant the world to them. At home that night, Jamie tucked Ruby into bed. She held her Hero Daddy badge high against her chest, eyelids heavy, the softness of sleep stealing up on her. Jamie read the same book he had read 1,000 times, watched her breath even as the words flowed. When he turned out the light, Ruby whispered, "Daddy, remember when you saved the computers?" Her voice, a child's way of turning the world back into story, made him laugh softly. "I remember," he said, "but I remember you better." She smiled and drifted towards sleep. Jamie sat by the window for a while, watching the streetlights and thinking of the architecture of trust, patient, built brick by brick. He thought of Diana, of Valerie, of Stephanie and Laura, of the board that could somehow find humility. He thought of his wife, Natalie, of the way her laugh had echoed in empty rooms. He thought of the incredible moment, how small acts could tilt systems and lives. Diana, at the office late that night, went to the wall where the framed copies of early company press releases hung. Headlines about mergers, fundraising, and growth. She added a small placard beneath them, not a press release, but a reminder. See people first. It was the kind of institutional artifact that no investor would list in a quarter, but it changed the mood of the hallway. There were, of course, setbacks. Not every hire in the Second Chance program thrived. Not every policy nuance anticipated every human complexity. There were budgetary fights and moments when old habits tugged back. But the net they built caught more than it missed. Employees who once kept their heads down began to raise concerns without fear. Teams talked about work life in direct language. Diana often walked the floors, sharing small conversations rather than directives, learning to listen as a habit. Months slipped into a kind of steady work. The company no longer defined itself merely by deals and valuations. It defined itself by its capacity to absorb failure and still choose people. Jamie found new joy in mentoring, and he watched as Ruby learned to trust systems and people in equal measure. They took their small vacation at the edge of the sea, where Ruby learned to step carefully into waves and to collect smooth stones. They returned with a jar of sand that sat on their windowsill like a promise. The last scene in the company's narrative, if narratives must have a last scene, was small and personal. A year and 2 weeks after the night the screens died, Diana walked into Jamie's office unannounced with a takeout bag. She sat down in the chair on the other side of his desk, no podium, no staff, and handed him a napkin and a burger. They ate together, a ritual she had not imagined herself performing in the way we imagine kings dining with the countryside.
They shared the kind of conversation that is its own kind of policy. Stories about Ruby's 4th-grade teacher, a joke about a broken toaster, a small plan to expand the Employee Assistance Fund. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small framed photograph, the office the night before the systems went down, captured by a security camera. Empty chairs, screens awash in red, the mop bucket leaning against the wall. It was not flattering. It was memory and truth. "Keep it," she said, as if the object had been a talisman against forgetting. "So we don't." Jamie accepted it with a look that was both grateful and amused by the symbolism. He set it on his windowsill next to Ruby's drawing. They both smiled, not only at the image, but at the quiet work it represented. Policy turned to practice, rescue turned to reform. When the company filed its next annual report, it included a short section titled Resilience Through People. Under it, it noted metrics and programs and small narratives about employees who had come through the Second Chance program. It was not a marketing flourish, it was an honest accounting of a culture trying to match language with action. The investors noticed the steadier performance. The community noticed the job opportunities and the family supports. The press, hungry for a neat storyline, alternated between jubilation and skepticism. The people who lived inside the company, Jamie's, Diana's, Stephanie's, Valerie's, and Laura's, lived the messier truth, that institutions are built from human habits, and that habits change slowly when people choose to change them. In private moments, Diana sometimes returned to the memory of that night. The mopping man whose steady hands rewired her sense of worth and responsibility. She thought not only of the rescue, but of what followed, the slow, focused work of remediation. She understood now that leadership requires more than strategy. It requires the ability to see and to be seen. Jamie taught her how to listen as a practice, not a PR move. At the center of the story, the incredible moment remained. It was retold not as legend, but as an aperture, a night when one man's choice to act exposed possibilities in others. The janitor who had walked into a server room and bought the company time had, in doing so, bought Diana a new language for leadership. He had shown that quiet competence and a life built around caring for a child could be as generative to an empire as any merger. The result was not a tidy victory lap, but a long, ongoing project of repair. A final image. Diana watched Ruby skip ahead of Jamie on the sidewalk, her small silhouette bobbing with the joy of someone carrying crayons and a future. Diana's face had the relaxed softness of someone who had learned to trade urgency for particular places. She walked beside them to the crosswalk and held Jamie's elbow in a brief, familiar way, an unromantic gesture of mutual understanding.
They had become, in the language of the firm and the language of their lives, chosen family. If one had to name the pivot that altered everything, it would still be the mop against the console, the patient work under fluorescent light, and the decision to act rather than retreat. That incredible moment, the janitor who transformed a billionaire's life forever, had been real in its simplicity. It became a parable in the company's growing lexicon, a reminder that, sometimes, the people we least notice carry the keys to our survival. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to be seen.